So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to York Festival of Ideas. My name's Michael White, and I'll be chairing the event this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here. So, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Justin Jacobs. Justin Jacobs is Professor of History at American University, Washington, D.C. in the US. His books include Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures, which published by Reaction in 2025, and The Compensations of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures in 2020. Tonight is going to be specifically talking about Plunder, which I have here to wave around. And so, Justin, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction, and thank you, everyone, for joining my talk today. It's a great pleasure to be here at the York Festival of Ideas, and I got a lot I want to cover in the next 35 to 40 minutes, so let me sort of just dive right into it. What I'd like to be able to do over the next little more than half hour is give you an introduction, a little bit of what my book is about. Obviously, not everything, but the big ideas, how I came to this project, the argument that I ended up developing, much to my own surprise, to be honest, so that you go away and perhaps you'll be a little more curious and you might want to pick up the book and see my full array of evidence and the argument as it's fully developed. So I'll begin sort of talking about the origin of this project. How did I get into a research topic in which I would eventually write a book in which I didn't put sort of a colon after Plunder, which would be more of a statement, but instead I said, no, I think that's got to be a question mark. How did I get to this point? Well, really, I've been working on this project in one form or another for the past 2 decades. And the origin of this really does go back when I was in my mid-20s, starting out in grad school. And believe it or not, it actually started through my interest in modern Chinese history. I originally got my PhD in modern Chinese history, and I focused on the northwestern Muslim region, or at least it used to be a majority Muslim region known as Xinjiang, which is its most defining geographical feature, perhaps, is the Taklamakan Desert that I pointed out here. Dunhuang is a very famous archaeological site where tens of thousands of ancient manuscripts were discovered in the first decade of the 20th century. And I originally was studying the political history of Xinjiang in the 20th century Chinese history. Now, at the time that I was originally starting off with this, the reason I was interested in this part of China was because of September 11th. It may seem like old history to many of us now, but that was when the so-called war on terror was on, and as well used the American war on terror as a pretext to crack down on what they called were extremists in Xinjiang. So at the time, I was like, oh, I really want to study this part of and I started out studying political history, and very quickly I realized, oh, this is also the part of the world, the part of China, where the very famous Western archaeologist, Hungarian-born but British naturalized archaeologist Oral Stein, this is where he undertook 4 separate and very famous archaeological expeditions to this part of China. The first one was in the year 1900, and then he did 3 more after that, all the way until 1930. This photograph here showing him with one of the Chinese officials from the very last expedition that he did. Stein and others, such as the French sinologist Paul Pelliot, here he is in the famous Cave 17 Dunhuang, about to remove almost 10,000 of the roughly 40,000 ancient manuscripts that were piled up there in the background. It's one of the most magnificent photos that we have in the history of archaeology. Stein and men like Pelliot, they took away tens of thousands of artifacts, manuscripts, and other artifacts from the northwestern deserts and caves of the Qing Empire, and then eventually the successor Republic of China. It's really the Taklamakan Desert and the oases around there. It's really an archaeological backdrop that is only equaled by Egypt, but of course much less famous outside of China than Egypt is. So I tried to combine these 2 distinct interests in one topic: modern Chinese history, which I had been trained in, and Stein's expeditions to Xinjiang, the most famous foreign archaeologist who had gone Sichuan to Xinjiang. Both of these, my interest overlapped temporally in the early 20th century. And the following research question naturally emerged when I thought, how do I combine China and archaeology and Stein? Well, the question emerged was the following. What did the Chinese think about what these guys were doing? Did they resist them? You see here, here's Stein on the right, hanging out with a couple of Chinese officials. The magistrate Zhu Reichi, I'll have another slide in a moment in which his writing pen will feature. What did the Chinese elites, Chinese officials, Chinese peasants who provided manual labor? Out in Xinjiang, you also have Muslim peasants as well who provided manual labor. What did all of these people think about what Stein and Paleo were doing? Now, most Western and most Chinese intellectual discourse portrays the Chinese of this period, when Westerners were removing so many things from China, as imperialist dupes, perhaps. They simply didn't know what these cunning Westerners were doing. They were deceived. They did these things in the shadows, in secret. Or they're portrayed as venal officials. Well, they were simply bribed. They were willing to take money and betray their nation. Or they were helpless victims. They wanted to resist. They would have if they could have, but these are the imperialists with their big guns and whatnot, and the threat of an army behind them. They just couldn't resist. They had no choice. Well, I wanted to test these portrayals against whatever sort of historical evidence that I could uncover. I had assumed that there was evidence that was backing up these portrayals. And I thought, well, let me go look in the Chinese case. In other words, what I wanted to do was I wanted to set out to recover the voices of non-Western historical actors in the source countries, the archaeological source countries, who were somehow involved or otherwise associated with the Western removal of artifacts from their countries. And really, I saw myself as restoring their historical agency. Let's stop speaking for them and hear what they had to say themselves about what they thought the Westerners were doing. And let me be honest, I fully expected when I set out on this project 20 years ago, I expected that the Chinese and Muslim voices that I would recover would be critical. I thought, well, of course I'm going to find Chinese documents where even back then they were complaining about, oh, I wish I could resist this guy. He's stealing things from my country, but nothing I can do about it. They're too strong. Or maybe I'd find things where they said, oh my goodness, I only later on found out that he removed these things. I had no idea that he took these things. And I thought I was going to find the Chinese were criticizing them way back at the time this was happening as thieves, as imperialist thieves, and that they were going to lament their lost heritage. Now, recovering their voices, trying to see what they said, it seems like a very simple proposition, but I soon discovered that it was a surprisingly rare research methodology. I looked through the scholarship, the secondary scholarship, and I thought someone must have tried to study what the Chinese thought of what Orlstein or Paul Paleo was doing. And I discovered, much to my surprise, that it simply had not been done before. No one had actually tried to interrogate this question from the perspective of Chinese language sources. Now, there are some big methodological barriers. You need to learn the language of the source country, the archaeological source country. You can't just read the Western languages of the archaeologist, although you have to do that as well. And you have to come up with some creative ways of recovering the voices of poor people who often don't leave their own records. But nevertheless, this is not impossible to do. So what are some of the results of my research? This is what I want to give you a taste of today. I found a wide array of contemporary Chinese responses to what men like Orlstein and other Western collectors were doing in their country. But none more short and sweet, perhaps, than the letters that were sent to Stein after he left their country by 3 different officials. And I'm going to show you some of the evidence that I found. And very appropriately for a talk like this, much of the evidence that I found was found in the UK. A lot of this stuff is still sitting in boxes in the archives of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where Stein bequeathed most of his papers after he died in 1943. So the guy that was sitting in the middle in the screenshot that you just had here a minute ago, the Chinese official Zhu Reichi. Jurature. Well, this is what I found in the Bodleian Library. I was able to find that Stein had preserved in his own papers the letters that these Chinese officials had written to him. Now, this is actually just one page of what is a three-page letter, so I'm just giving you a little flavor of this, and this is just an excerpt that you can see here on the right. This is my own English translation, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. You don't have to read the entire thing, but you can see it in the first couple of sentences. It's very respectful. It's very flattering. You can see that he's clearly seen Stein as someone who is worthy of being admired. And then he says that he heard later on from the British consulate in Kashgar, he heard that when he was leaving his country, when he was leaving China or the Xinjiang region over the Himalayan mountains, he actually got frostbitten and he lost a toe, I believe it was. And so he is kindly talking about that and saying how sad this made him feel. And then if you look towards the end, he says, here's one of my lines that's one of my favorites. It really shocked me at the time when I first found this. Everywhere you set your foot, dear sir, becomes famous, from the luster you confer on the sands of the Gobi Desert to the distinction you confer on the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains. Upon my mind is engraved the fervent desire to see you return to your country in an ethereal carriage pulled by piebald horses to receive your just due in honors and recognition. Very flowery purple prose, to be sure, but the meaning is still clear. You're going to be hard-pressed to find any sense of criticism in a letter like this whatsoever. He's saying, I hope that on the basis of your archaeological labors in my country, that you'll go home and be promoted, essentially. Right? There's another example. Again, you got the original letter there on the right, and you've got the official, Li Shurong, who also met Stein on his third expedition. This is a letter from 1915, and I'm giving once again an excerpt of my English, English translation of the Chinese original. And this one I do want to read off in whole because there's a lot of really interesting points that bear highlighting. Across multiple meetings over several days, I was able to see that you are a man of outstanding character and broad mind, unsurpassed in elegance and refinement. A man like you must rise above the worthiest men of his country from a young age. I saw the ink traces of the Han and Tang dynasties that you have collected. In spite of their tattered condition, the essence of antiquity is variously evident, as if the faces of the ancients stood right before me. You, Mr. Stein, do not shirk from any danger or obstacle in scouring grottos or collecting wooden slips. And then blah, blah, blah. Standing in deep admiration of your formidable mind and wishing to partake of its bounty, I detest the late hour of our gathering. Now, the most important part of this excerpt to me is about 3 lines in. I saw the ink traces of the Han and Tang dynasties that collected. We'll see in the modern political discourse about what happened is that the Chinese, or the people who lived in the source country anywhere in the world, doesn't have to just be China, were regularly deceived. They simply did not know what was going on. And in some cases, that's true. I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture of everything. But as this one shows, here he is even, you can see in the original Chinese voice that has been recovered from this document, he is acknowledging quite clearly that I saw what Stein's taking away, and I still have an incredibly positive assessment of him. And then the third and last one that I'm going to show you, I have many more, but this is enough for our purposes today. A letter from the magistrate Dai Changmo in 1913. And essentially, you can probably get a sense of that here. He is simply saying, hey man, I've traveled all over the world. I'm a very worldly, cosmopolitan person. However, and I've met a lot of really incredible people. But Orlstein's one of the most incredible of all. And he says, I have viewed the collection of books that he has authored and annotated, and he's very much hoping that we can remain friends. Now, in my analysis, I have a lot more evidence than this. This is, again, just to give you a little taste of the sort of things that I build my arguments on. In my analysis of Chinese discourse about Western archaeologists and their activities in their countries, I have not found, and I've looked hard for it, I have not found a single instance of anyone describing Western collecting activities with criminalizing language prior to 1924. And by criminalizing language, I mean the usual verbs that we regard as, indicating that a criminal act has taken place. Loot, plunder, steal. Instead, looking through hundreds of Chinese sources and documents before 1924, instead of loot, plunder, and steal, I find things like take, obtain, remove, carried away, transferred, in their Chinese originals. Those are, again, the English equivalents of the Chinese verbs that are being used. And that's telling. And that's telling. This is yet another indication that the Chinese who were interacting with Stein, for the most part, knew what he was taking away. When they described what he had done, they did not describe it as any type of theft that we would recognize today. What about the lower classes? Well, Chinese officials are the ones signing the paperwork, giving the orders to go help Stein and whatnot. But a guy like this that you see right here, he's not going to go out in below freezing desert conditions and shovel dirt for someone like Stein. So we also need to say, okay, well, that's just one segment of Chinese society. There are other segments that we need to examine as well. In this particular region, the people who are providing the muscle, the labor, are going to be the Muslim peasants, who are mostly poor people. So I have a couple of examples that I want to present today. Here is the German archaeologist Albert von Lecoq and an unknown Uyghur guide. I'm going to give you an example of a poem that was written in praise of Albert von Lecoq, a German archaeologist, by one of his Uyghur guides. It could very well be this guy, but this guy is not noted. His name is not noted on the photograph, so I don't know if it's him, but it could very well be him. It was one of his Uyghur guides, a man by the name of Obul Madi. Obul Madi. This is an incredible source written in the Turkic language, which would now be known as Uyghur, and it was discovered by the history professor Eric Schlussel, a colleague of mine who is now actually at Oxford University. And I want to give you a couple of excerpts from this. This is one of the rare lower class Uyghurs who worked for someone like a foreign archaeologist who also was literate, could write in the Arabic script as well, in the Uyghur language. And here again, the full poem is worth reading, but you can also see a couple of the excerpts that I have here. A kind and friendly man, who if he likes the treasure in your hand or the paper manuscript that you give him, he will give you money for it. If he doesn't like the paper, he will give it back. Right? He said, "I'll pay any good man." We folks looked at the old plaster and thought, for the fresco paintings, no one had ever paid a cent. You showed me kindness, but then after, what else will I do to eat? If you would have me in your service, then I would come every day and beg and hope from the FND, referring to Albert von Lecoq, the equipment that I need. Here we're seeing a consistent theme is that this somewhat lower class, economically in an economic and social sense, a lower class Muslim guide is highlighting not the same things that the Chinese officials did, but nonetheless, he too found things that were worth praising, and he got something out of this exchange, this relationship. I would gloss this as economic capital. This is the compensation that he's getting back that he views as so valuable that before Lecoq left the country, he wrote a poem in praise of him, in which he's saying, this stuff used to be worthless. No one had ever paid a cent for those fresco paintings, but he's willing to pay us for things that we previously regarded as worthless. The other example, I don't have any photos to share here, but this was equally fascinating. This example came from the field diary of the American climatologist. He was a scholar. He was once very famous, not so much anymore. Ellsworth Huntington, from March 14th, 1906. He had a Uyghur assistant who is known as Daoud. And while I was reading Ellsworth Huntington's diary, it's held in the Yale University Library, I found the following excerpt, handwritten in his scrawl, in which he's talking about how Huntington had an audience with the local Chinese governor, the Chinese governor of the province, a very high-ranking, powerful man. And he brought Daoud with him. Daoud had been a good laborer. He had done great service. And Ellsworth Huntington wanted to reward him. And this is what happens. He said his supreme ambition is to become a beg, a village headman, a local official, essentially. Not a big beg, but a little one with some simple work adapted to his ability. As he has been very faithful in spite of his shortcomings, I asked the governor, the Chinese governor, to give him such an office. That is, to give him a letter to that effect to the local official at Caria, telling at the same time what sort of man he is, faithful and honest, but not especially clever. The governor promised to do so, and when he called on me, asked to see the man. Poor Daoud, most horribly frightened, was brought in, and after falling on his knees at the door and bowing his close-shaven head to the ground half a dozen times, advanced nearer to be looked at. I suppose it was the great experience of his life, one that he will boast of till his death. For as Ibrahim said, a man like that could not procure a personal interview with the governor if he paid $5,000. This highlights a novel method of voice recovery. Right? Daoud did not leave any records in his own voice saying what he thought about Ellsworth Huntington or the removal of artifacts from his land. So you have to carefully parse some of the sources left behind by Westerners who interacted with them and then recorded what happened. Are there some unpleasant things that today make us bristle? Yeah, there's some backhanded praise here as well. On one hand, he says something nice about Daoud, and then he also calls him not especially clever. When Huntington later went back home to Yale and wrote the book that made him famous in the first part of the 20th century, it was all about how different climates determined superior and inferior races. Not very pleasant to see that sort of ideology. But I think it's very important that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, and dismiss everything that these guys wrote as imperialist lies. If Ellsworth Huntington was there and Daoud was there, and he describes this in his diary, I'm inclined to think that this is probably what happened. He didn't publish this. There was no performative aspect to this. It wasn't published for an audience later on. He needed to understand what motivated the people who provided labor for him in order to work with them and give them incentives that would make them want to work for him as well. So, needless to say, these sorts of reactions were the exact opposite of what I fully expected to encounter in my historical source base. All right, so now comes the even trickier part. If this is what they thought of him, it was just overwhelming praise. I mean, I'm telling you, if I looked at 50 sources, I might find one or two that had even the mildest amount of criticism. Most of the sources are in this vein across the social and economic spectrum, whether you're a wealthy, powerful Chinese elite or a poor Muslim peasant. So if that's what their voices actually said and what they actually thought of what was going on, now comes the harder part. Why did they think and talk the way that they did? Right, there's Orlstein with one of his archaeological teams. In other words, why did all the men who are in this portrait around Orlstein, right, why didn't they regard Western collectors and archaeologists as imperialist thieves? Or how come they didn't regard the Chinese officials who wrote those letters as venal and corrupt traitors to their nation? It's only the first step to say they didn't see this as theft. They liked Stein. They had positive impressions. Now you got to answer the next question, which is much harder. Well, why? Why did they think that way? And the answer that I came to after much trial and error and going around and around was actually deceptively simple. I was surprised how simple this answer was when I finally came to it. I was overthinking it for many years. The answer was because almost none of them believed in the existence or relevance of nations. Right? Why weren't these people who helped Stein and wrote glowing letters about him and worked with him year after year, why weren't they seen as corrupt traitors to their nation? Because none of them believed in the existence or relevance of such nations. This is the single most important thing we need to understand to make sense of how so many artifacts ended up in Western museums from the non-Western world over the past 3 centuries. And to sort of dig a little bit deeper into that, because we are so conditioned in our world today. From the moment we're born, we are constantly bombarded with the discourse that we all belong to nations that go way back into the primordial past, and we have some sort of innate thing in common with other people who are part of our nations as well. That idea is so ingrained in us today from the moment we're born, it can seem extremely counterintuitive to try to interrogate that. But that's what I had to do for this project. Now, I don't know about anyone else who's been to grad school, but back when I was in grad school 20 years ago, we all had to read a foundational work of modern identity politics. This is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. This was one of the biggest things, you had to read this right off the bat to understand the essential artificiality of our concept of modern nations. Here's the executive summary in the interest of time. Our modern concepts of nation, the American nation, all right, the French nation, the Ukrainian nation, the Chinese nation, are very recent inventions, historically speaking. We're talking the last couple hundred years, more or less, that are filled with much arbitrary and superficial content that is fed to us largely by political and media elites who wants us to subscribe to the idea that there are these things called nations and we belong to them for their own economic and political agendas. Nations are powerful ideological constructs that allow us humans to be mobilized in greater numbers than ever before for both good, large charitable works and whatnot, and bad. Things like the Holocaust requires an enormous coordinated effort for these sorts of things to happen, and nations are something that gets people on board to act in the name of nations or nefariously against certain nations that they blame for the world's ills. Now, nations undoubtedly have elements of authentic substance. The best lies always contain a kernel of truth, right? But they are fundamentally artificial and abstract constructs that must be proactively pounded into our minds. We all get misty-eyed about our national identities at certain solemn moments in our lives, at curated major events, elections, political debates, solemn political speeches, the State of the Union. Interestingly enough, often at sporting events here in the United States, you always have the national anthem being sung out. Everyone gets up, you rise up, take off your hat, show respect, hand over your heart, and you say things like you're, an indelible part of this inalienable nation that has been around forever. And you have something in common with all the other 40,000 people in this sports stadium who you would normally never interact with in your everyday life and probably wouldn't identify with. Yet for that moment, you're thinking, we are all Americans, right? They have cultivated that emotion out of you. And then we return to our everyday lives where family, work, recreation, and religion prove far more relevant to our everyday identities. Take a Silicon Valley software engineer and a rancher from Wyoming. Sorry, my examples are all drawn from the United States. Take a Silicon Valley software engineer and a rancher from Wyoming out to a football game, soccer or American football. And they'll both say that they are Americans during the national anthem and say, you and me, bud, we're from the same group. But if they ever encountered each other outside of these nationally curated moments, they'd likely be hard-pressed to see any primordial bond of solidarity between each other at all. Now, why does this all matter? Back to the topic of my research. Because it has a direct bearing on the perceived valuations that we and everyone else involved in these archaeological expeditions project onto historical art and artifacts. In other words, the perceived values of such objects, like you're seeing here, these are some Buddhist artifacts that were dug up by Paul Paleo, the French stenologist Paul Paleo in northwestern China. The perceived value of these sorts of objects changed dramatically before and after nationalist ideas are embraced by modern humans. And it was undeniably Westerners, Western Europeans, who brought nationalist ideas to other parts of the world, which means there's sort of a time lag between nation-influenced valuations of artifacts, the perceived value of what these things on the screen in front of you mean to different people. So, when early Western collectors like Stein, influenced by nationalist ideas, went abroad to the non-Western world, he's viewing the artifacts that he sees as priceless emblems of their source nations. At the same time, he is hiring and dining out with some of the Chinese officials. He is encountering non-Western people in those source nations that did not yet share that view, that these are priceless emblems of the nations in the ancient past that created them, and that there are people who are descended from those nations today. These people did not share that view yet. They would eventually, but not yet. Which means that one side viewed artifacts as priceless emblems of nations that needed to be quote unquote saved. Yes, this is a pejorative discourse at the time, that needed to be saved from their so-called fallen, degenerate descendants of their once noble ancestral nations in antiquity. While the other side, the non-Western hosts, continued for at least a generation or two to see those same artifacts through a pre-nationalist prism. What was that pre-nationalist prism? Well, this is what I explore in my book and in my research. And I break it down by class. That is to say, wealthy and privileged Chinese or Turkish officials viewed artifacts differently than their poor illiterate subjects did. And I have to recover that valuation, the different valuation in my research. I need to get evidence of both poor Chinese peasants, poor Muslim peasants, and wealthy literate Chinese elites. I need to find evidence for all of them of what they thought the value of these artifacts was. Right? Instead of priceless, which is what Stein brings that valuation with him, because he's thinking in terms, these are emblems of primordial nations, what were once great, and these are the fallen descendants of those nations, and I have to save it on their behalf. Instead of priceless, everyone else in this picture has seen it as something else. They're seeing the things that they're helping him remove as not priceless, but precious, or profitable, or worthless. And those valuations are different depending on their individual unique background. At the top of the local social hierarchy are going to be an educated Chinese elite. Now, that's this guy right here, on Stein's right, on our left, Jiang Xiaowan. Now, he wasn't very wealthy. He was sort of a poor scholar, but nevertheless, he had received a classical Confucian education, and he saw himself as having more in common with his social betters than his social inferiors. So he aspires to be a Chinese elite. Stein hired him as a secretary, and his help was essential for Stein being able to identify and remove so many Chinese artifacts. What does he see it as? He sees it as precious, the things that are being removed, but with an important caveat. Not precious to the nation, which he doesn't believe in, but precious to his identity as hopefully one day wealthy or upwardly aspirationally mobile. His identity as the one day wealthy, cultivated, and powerful person who deserved to rule over the more unenlightened subjects. Right? There is no sense of national solidarity. And for this point, I want to bring out another piece of evidence here. This is one of my favorite paintings from the 18th century. The famous Qianlong Emperor ruled for over 60 years from the 1730s to the 1790s. And here I'm going to give you a sense of, try to break down our comfortable notions that these assumptions we often have about nations and how everyone believes in this. Everyone in the Chinese nation recognizes they're part of the Chinese nation and that this is a betrayal of the Chinese nation if you let something that is associated with their ancestors leave the boundaries of that nation. Well, no, that sort of sense of solidarity, national solidarity, didn't exist before the Westerners introduced modern nationalist concepts. Here is a painting of the emperor who owns countless works of artwork and ancient Chinese artifacts. Same sort of things that Westerners were removing 100 years later. This is him viewing them. And you can see here, you can kind of follow the action. You've got his servants who are bringing out, here's a huge vase, and here are other things that are paintings most likely, or small jade objects that are closed in boxes, or closed in sort of a tube. And then when they get to the upper right part of this painting, they unfurl it for Qianlong alone, for the emperor alone, as he sips tea and eats nuts and whatnot. He is showing that he is a cultivated gentleman who can appreciate high art. But make no mistake, he owns all of this, and he doesn't believe that it belongs to the Chinese nation, or that any other Chinese person, any of his subjects, has a right to see this or touch it or regard it as their own. It's personal property, right? Even though he rules over the Chinese nation, he does not subscribe to the ideas about a Chinese nation having collective ownership of these objects. These are his. And it's made very obvious in a visual sense from this painting. What was the view that Chinese commoners got of these same sort of artifacts? Well, at the risk of being a little bit too humorous, this was the view. This was the view of Chinese commoners towards the treasures of the Qianlong Emperor. They saw the moat and the high walls of the Forbidden City. The stuff inside doesn't belong to them. It's not theirs. Today, they are taught, oh, there's a museum, there's a public museum. You can go to the Forbidden City. Every Chinese can go, and you'll be told these belong to you. We're all a part of the Chinese nation. Your ancestors made this, and it's priceless. Back then, no, no one's going. If you try to swim over the moat and climb over the wall, you're getting your head cut off. No one's going to say, "Oh, fellow member of the Chinese nation, let's go look and appreciate our collective ancestry." Right? The Benin bronzes, which are often in the news. If you look back at their original provenance, they were exclusive works of the royal family with mythological motifs that lionize the highly embellished origins of the ancestors of the Benin royal family and the founding of the royal house. Right? They were not seen as sort of art for the people or art that celebrated the entire Nigerian nation. It did not belong to them. It belonged to the king. And in fact, recently there was a little bit of a snafu in the news. I think there were some Benin bronzes that were returned, and in a very rare instance of a modern person continuing to adopt the ideology of the old days. The present-day Nigerian king essentially said, these belong to me. They don't belong to the nation, and he wanted them put in his royal palace for him, his exclusive property of his ancestors. That is actually a shockingly honest continuation of the old pre-nationalist view of who these truly belong to. They weren't seen as things that were stolen from the Nigerian nation. They were stolen from the Nigerian king, who used them to prop up his position at the top of the socio-political economic hierarchy in his country. At the bottom of the social hierarchy, men like these guys here who dug for Stein, I examined the profitable and worthless valuations. They didn't see it as precious. They saw these things as profitable or worthless. That's the valuation they projected onto these artifacts by the lower classes. They were often destroyed in the early days when there was no use seen for them whatsoever. They just threw it in the river sometimes, right? Or they might reuse it as fertilizer. And that's a sense of economic capital. It's valuable to them. It's useful. It's profitable. It'll replace the cost of fertilizer to take an old fresco and crumble it up and put it in the fields. Now I don't have to pay for fertilizer. That was the local value. And then later when the Westerners come and they offer significantly more than the cost of fertilizer for this thing, they say, well, this is really profitable now. They are far exceeding the valuation that I originally had. Right? The key point here, faced with pre-nationalist views of artifacts, all the Westerner had to do was offer something in exchange that exceeded the local pre-nationalist perceived value. Not the Westerner's own priceless view, which the locals did not share, but the local perceived value of worthless, profitable, or precious. I call these the compensations of cooperation. Right? And in the book, Plunder with a question mark, I examine several different types of these compensations of cooperation. Diplomatic capital. I don't have time to go into it here, but if I could do a whole hour-long lecture on the Elgin marbles, which are always in the news. If you recover the entire original political context, you realize that the Elgin marbles were essentially another gift given to Lord Elgin, the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, as a form of gratitude for Britain helping the Sultan recover the lost province of Egypt that Napoleon had occupied. In this sense, the Sultan, and it's the same guy right here, sorry, it's not the same guy, but it's his ancestor, Muhammad Ali, is exchanging the artifacts of Egypt for things like diplomatic capital that he regards as far more valuable than what's being removed. Economic capital, such as the local Egyptian laborers who helped Giovanni Belzoni transport the Memnon head. They did not have a perception of cultural continuity with the pre-Islamic artifacts that dotted the Egyptian countryside. And when Giovanni Belzoni comes over and says, I'll pay you good wages to help me remove this, they say that form of economic capital exceeds the local valuation that we applied to this hunk of granite. And therefore, we will be willing to help you remove it. In addition to diplomatic and economic capital, there are also things like social capital and political capital. We don't see these things anymore. They are lost to us, but as a historian, I have tried to recover. This was their motivation. This was why they helped out. Because according to their own value system back then, the Westerner gave them something that was worth helping him remove artifacts for. And I hate to put it this way, but all parties came away from this transaction pretty happy with what they had gotten in exchange. They all felt they got something that exceeded their resources that they expended in helping this thing be removed. All right. Once all the non-Western historical voices are recovered, we see clearly why the vast majority of Western acquisitions were not viewed as morally odious at the time. The only reason we think so today is because non-Westerners have now also subscribed to nationalist valuations and identities, which makes everyone forget that there was another prior framework of valuation that preceded our modern nationalist ideas. Right? So now, since we can't think, it never occurs to us to even think outside of a nationalist framework because it's like the air we breathe. We assume that everyone involved must have been betraying their nation of origin, willingly or unwillingly. They were coerced, they were bribed, they were forced to do it. All right. Thus, the Western imperialists have to be seen as thieves, while the natives are seen as a mix of unsuspecting dupes, corrupt officials, or coerced victims who would have resisted if they had bigger guns. Finish up here in just the next minute or two, and I'll be happy to take questions. My research, I think, shows otherwise. All right. That the natives, such as this Egyptian man who was helping Howard Carter with Tutankhamun's tomb in the 1920s, or the Uyghur guide who works for Albert von Lecoq, the people who lived in the source countries thought differently about the artifacts. They did not regard them as the inalienable possessions of abstract nations until they or their descendants themselves became Western educated. As a result, it was perfectly okay in their eyes, according to their value system and how they thought of the world, to allow someone from another nation to take them away, provided that person gave them a form of compensation that exceeded local pre-nationalist valuations. The result is that most things you see in a Western museum, not everything, but most things you see in a Western museum, I believe, on the basis of my research, were regarded at the time as wholly legitimate acquisitions according to the beliefs and terms of exchange agreed upon by the original parties involved. Our present day moral judgments of what happened, I often think of it as a historical ventriloquism. We project our own ideological agendas and beliefs into the mouths of people in history who can't speak for themselves. I thought when I did my research, I would find that they agreed with those our modern day present assessments. And I was shocked when I found that they didn't. And so there's a little bit of irony here. In calling for repatriation in almost everything you see in a Western museum, we think we're advocating on behalf of marginalized peoples whose voices have been suppressed, when in fact, we are the ones who are suppressing their voices today by not letting their very surprising pre-nationalist views be heard of what they thought of what was going on at the time period. Thank you for your patience. Sorry, I probably took a little bit more time than I should. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you so much. So stimulating. So we've got a bunch of questions,
Hmm.
and they're sort of in a few little groups. But one particular guest was straight off the bat with the big one. So I think maybe we should go straight in. So Aurora asked. So in this moment, a lot of people are questioning colonialism and how it's impacted cultural heritage. Do you agree that England, Spain, Germany, and other European colonialist countries should return all the objects they extract from countries around the world to the original countries? So maybe we'll just start with it, say that's sort of the biggie.
Yeah. Well, that's the big question. And that's really what my research is trying to address. And I have to, speak in my professional capacity here as a historian. And as a historian, the way that I approach this is to say that I obviously understand there's a lot more considerations today. Not everyone even understands what people in the old days thought, the valuations that they projected onto these things. And a lot of this has to do with perceived power imbalances in the world today. And so there's a lot of other considerations that go on here. I would simply say that before we sort of have a reckless, or not reckless is a bit too strong of a word, but just sort of rushing into well, if it's in a Western museum, it must have been acquired by immoral methods. I would suggest that in every case, we should make an effort to reconstruct the original understanding on which these things were removed from the source country and taken there, because I think it matters. I think it matters to realize that if at the time, not only did no one involved in this removal think that it was theft, but on the contrary, they were actually overwhelmingly positive about it and thanked the foreigner for what they had given him in an exchange. I mean, think about that guy Daoud, in which his friend Ibrahim literally says he couldn't have gotten an interview with the governor if he had paid $5,000, more money than he would make in several lifetimes. All right, that's a form of economic compensation. The equivalent of Ellsworth Huntington writing a letter of recommendation to get a really great job promotion, essentially. That's what he's viewing. He's saying, this is so much more valuable than what he took away according to my value system. And I really just, I don't want to take a overt political stand of no, it shouldn't happen, or yes, it should happen. I just want to say, let's give the full historical process and keep an open mind. And with each artifact, try to reconstruct the understanding on which it left the source country. And I think you'll be surprised. And it will be harder to take a strong political stance one way or the other. And as a scholar and as a historian, I like that. I like that when things are complex, morally gray, and you realize it's not so cut and dry. It's not just good guys and bad guys. It's a pretty complex situation, and it's we don't want to be politicians here. We want to be scholars who recognize that complexity and the ambiguity.
Great, thank you so much. And so, obviously, for the purposes of a relatively short talk, you focused, quite specifically, a lot of time actually on a specific location to give us that kind of depth, and also so China in particular. But we've had some, questions about other
Mhm.
contexts and places. So I realize that you might not be an expert on everything, but David has asked about Ashanti gold regalia in the British Museum. Did it not have great symbolic value for the Ashanti and their culture? Surely they were not happy to see it go. And a little follow up about also something that might have had just material value on its own as well as kind of symbolic value. So yeah, just about you've had various points in the talk. You said doesn't sort of apply to everything, but
Mhm.
some comment perhaps about
Right.
another context.
Right. So in general, I'll say my research started out in China, and then at a certain point, I actually wrote a previous scholarly book on that in 2020. And then I thought, oh, I want to see, does this also apply to the rest of the world? And so I took the research findings that framework that I developed in the Chinese evidence, and I did apply it to the rest of the world. I should have said this earlier. And that's the present book, Plunder with a question mark, is my attempt to take that framework and see, does this apply in other parts of the world? Now, if you couldn't possibly even write a book that took account of every single artifact or type of place in the world and was able to talk about it in depth. And so I will admit that the specific example that was brought up by David, I believe, I'm not entirely familiar with. What I did in my book is I tried to take examples from around the world, but they are undoubtedly selective. They are the things that I'm more interested in. They are famous case studies like the Elgin marbles, the Memnum head, these sorts of things. And so while I can't off the top of my head, if I had 10 minutes and I could go, online and do some research on it, I could probably give you a somewhat informed opinion about what I think is likely going on there. I would just say that very likely, if you were to study the history of this particular artifact and find all the original papers, sources in the original language of the people who were, that it was taken from, you might be surprised. In fact, I'm quite certain that you will probably be surprised in trying to identify what were these motivations? What did they get out of it? It may not be something that we today recognize as more valuable because these valuations have changed. But I would be quite certain that unless this was taken by military plunder, which is absolutely a form of coercive, morally odious antiquity transfer, unless it was taken by military plunder or someone stealing it from their house, I would bet money that a form of acceptable compensation was provided to the people who handed this thing over. And I say that without actually having studied it, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. This isn't to say that things haven't been stolen. There are examples of some pretty morally odious artifacts that have been removed. I do believe, however, that they are in the minority. I think they're in the extreme minority of most of the stuff that you see in museums.
Great. Thank you. So, and also a couple of related questions from someone who's just identified as G. And they're both around this idea of nationhood and also the kind of movement of people. So there's I don't know whether it's really a question, but there's a sort of comment more about the Uyghurs and obviously identified them as Muslim, about how long they'd actually been living in that area, and about
Mhm.
their potential relationship to the artifacts that they are
Mhm.
encountering. So there's one sort of comment more about that, and another one is about previous moments in Chinese history, because it's a question about whether we can see nationhood as specifically Western. So this is about, why did the Ming Dynasty establish isolationism in 1371? So just about that, is there any sort of sense in which nationhood is, as you say, sort of imported in a kind of Western model?
Yeah, so the first question slash comment, I would simply say that in the course of my research, trying to determine local valuations of the non-Western people, what they thought the value of this thing was that was being taken away, one important factor that I always had to look at was, does the person in question have a perceived cultural continuity with the people who made this? So in the case, like in much of the Muslim world, this was one of the factors that made ancient pre-Islamic artifacts to be valued so low among the locals, whether they were elites or whether they were, poor laborers, was precisely because it was before the arrival of Islam. And so they were often seen as things that were made by pagans who had defied God, and God had destroyed them as a result and replaced it with a superior civilization. And so it was often seen with a fairly low value. And that's the same thing with the Uyghurs in northwestern China. They're Muslims, and many of the things that were being removed were Buddhist artifacts. But you have to examine everyone else. I also examined Chinese peasants, and I also examined the Chinese elites, and the Chinese elites absolutely have a sense of cultural continuity, a perceived sense of cultural continuity with the things that are being removed, and they are still okay with it. All it means is that their valuation is higher. Instead of being merely profitable, it's precious. And the Westerner is going to have to provide a more valuable form of compensation for them to let you take it away. But they still don't regard it as priceless. And in the second comment slash question about nations. This is something that scholars still debate, and there are some scholars in my own field, Chinese history as well, who write entire books about, actually, this whole idea of the Western nation being unique. I'm not so sure about that. We can go back to the Song Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty, 1,000 years ago, 600 years ago, and we can find some Chinese intellectuals who are saying things that sound eerily reminiscent of modern nationalist discourse. And I generally, personally, don't find those to be very convincing. I think there is a much stronger body of scholarship that says that it's not invented from scratch. Everything builds upon what came before it, and there may be some people, a sliver of the population who talked in ways about the Chinese people, about the Russian people that sound like modern nationalist discourse, but it's not the same. It's not as absolute, and there is no effort to try to convince everyone in the country that you are all belonging to this same nation, and that anything within the boundaries of this nation automatically belongs to that nation as well. Those sorts of ideas, it's often linked to race also. I still believe that those are very modern constructs. And when you see Westerners with that modern idea of race and nation put together and going out into the rest of the world, it very quickly becomes evident that the people they're encountering from all levels of society do not share that same conception of the nation and its relationship to these artifacts.
Very interesting. So I think that allows us to have a look at the question from Tanasis, actually, which is It's just very generally about the issue of taking cultural heritage from one place
Mhm.
to another. It just asks, don't you think the intention of extracting heritage from one place to another is in fact the problem? Even so it says, and not necessarily the methods, but just that idea
Mhm.
of, well, it should be over here rather than over there.
Yeah. I think today, when we're thinking in terms, again, I hate to sort of say it over and over again, when we think in terms of nation versus nation, that's very problematic and it looks morally bad. But one of the things that I found that really surprised me when I looked back at the historical sources around the world more than 100 years ago or so is how often, again, it wasn't simply that they didn't call them thieves, and it wasn't simply that they were very enthusiastic about it as well. It was also sometimes I would get the sense that the people in the host country, they actually found it flattering. They actually found it flattering. Wow, here are foreigners coming all the way around the world. And you're telling me that the only reason that he came around the world and spent all these resources and endured all this hardship was to take examples of artwork, of which there are many more that are still in our country, and then take it back to his country and put it on public display for the edification of his own people and his own nation. And more often than not, I found that many of the people in the source countries found that to be flattering. It was flattering, actually, that the Westerners were so interested in Chinese art to the extent they would actually want to remove it and put it on display and teach other people in other countries who will never visit China how great the ancient civilization of China was. And that's just one of those surprises that you find in the historical documents. It really blew my mind. I wasn't expecting to find that. But yes, so sometimes it was flattering that the Westerners were taking so many things away. It feels so weird even just to say that sentence, but that's what the historical evidence is saying.
Yeah, just a couple more questions. So one is someone is just anonymous has just asked about the involvement of these the laborers and
Mhm.
just about how much we know about them. If they, so you mentioned their rates of literacy, but if they were literate in the same language as the scrolls they're written,
Mhm.
could they have read them? We don't know. So just that question about the
Yeah.
knowledge, really. Mm.
Usually not, because day laborers and the local guides, more often than not, are not literate, because they're usually poor. That's the chief form of compensation that they are getting in exchange for lending their muscle, is the fact that they are incentivized by nothing more than good wages. Oftentimes, it's in the agricultural off season. You don't go to Egypt in the middle of the summer to do digs. You don't go to the Taklamakan Desert in the middle of the summer. You'll all die. You go in the winter, in which there oftentimes isn't a whole lot of work to do, and many of the local people are looking for work. And they say, "Wow, I've analyzed in my book. I analyzed the wages and the forms of economic compensation, and I find that the locals could potentially make quite a lot of money from the foreigner if they helped him out in various different capacities." And so, no, you do not usually find that. First of all, they rarely have a cultural connection. They themselves don't perceive that they are culturally connected to the ancient people who made this stuff. Oftentimes, that's what I see. But even when they do, they're often not literate. Like there's been some examples in the Chinese heartland where there's Chinese peasants and there's an old temple, and the Chinese peasants are starving. They want food. They're poor and lice-ridden, and they can't read the ancient stele on that ancient temple anyways. And they think that the gods have abandoned them. Otherwise, our lives wouldn't be so miserable. If this crazy foreigner is willing to pay us to take it away, the god that has abandoned us and an ancient slab of marble with characters that we can't read will be happy to take his money. That's often what I find as well.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we'll wrap up in a moment. So Dave has actually put in a little comment that to actually inform us that the artifacts he's talking about were taken as part of an aggressive military campaign.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
that clarifies that. Thank you, David.
And I will say
Um,
very, very quickly, in my book, I have a whole chapter in which I examine military plunder, and I absolutely acknowledge that this is morally odious, and it was recognized at the time as morally odious as well.
yeah, and then we're just finishing with Aurora. Just so I think what you've shown us a lot are about exchange and but a lot of asymmetries as well. And just to follow that last thought about actually about earning a living during this. So
Mhm.
Aurora's just asked about Poverty being coercive, people cannot decide freely if they're hungry. If someone offers you something to alleviate your needs, you agree with the exchange. So it didn't make the Western extraction a moral or fair exchange. So that's a question about the kind of asymmetries that you've found in the historical record.
Yeah, and this is a question that I've thought a lot about myself as well. Yeah, the Western archaeologist goes off into Egypt, he goes off into the Taklamakan Desert, and relative to the local people, he looks like he has a lot of money. And they look at him, and of course, there are power asymmetries, but I would say that it is largely an economic asymmetry. I would stop short of saying that it's usually a political or a military asymmetry. What I've found is, and I think this is something that we often forget, it's one of these very basic things to say, but it's easy to forget. Uh, Countries don't go to war over artifacts. They go to war over political and economic reasons, and then once the war breaks out, if it's convenient, they let their soldiers loot, and it's sort of collateral damage of the things that are removed away. But politicians back home usually don't support far-flung wars in other parts of the globe in order to loot the Forbidden City. That is sort of an outgrowth of another political goal that is trying to be achieved. So what you often find is that the stuff when it's being these power asymmetries. It's not as though Oral Stein is going to be able to call upon a military to come in if the locals don't do it. What I have found is that when the Westerners are finally kicked out of these countries and the locals say no, that happens towards the end of the 1920s in almost every single case, whether it's Howard Carter in Egypt in 1920s or it's Oral Stein in China in 1930. There did come a point where the people in power in the source country became Western educated and started to think in nationalist terms and said, this is priceless and we're going to keep him from taking it because we think the way he thinks now. When they decided to say no, all it took was denying the passport. That was it. It didn't require an army. When Egypt kicks Howard Carter out of the country and takes over King Tut's tomb, they're far less powerful, militarily speaking, than the Ottoman Empire was when the Ottoman Empire was allowing every single West foreign archaeologist to take stuff away. When China kicks out Oral Stein and other Western archaeologists in the late 1920s, it's the warlord era. They are far less powerful than the Qing Empire before. All this is to say is that yes, there are power asymmetries at the local level, but all it took was people in power who said, we don't want him to remove this stuff, and we're not going to stamp his passport. That's it. It did not take a huge show of military effort. You know why Oral Stein went 4 times to China? Because the Emir of Afghanistan continually denied him from getting the paperwork that would allow him to do archaeological expeditions in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a poor, fragmented country without a fearsome military, and they turned this representative of the most powerful British Empire in the early 20th century away over and over and over again. So we turned to the Qing, which was much more powerful, and they said yes, whereas the Emir of Afghanistan said no. That's all it took. You just had to say no. And they're not going to come to your country and take things away. So yes, there were power asymmetries, but I don't think they operated in the way that we often think they might have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Justin. I think we'll leave it there. It was incredibly interesting, very rich. Thank you for answering so many questions from the audience, and to the audience, thank you for attending today. And make sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival program. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Plunder, of Justin's book, then copies are available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. That's Fox Lane Books, all one word, .co.uk. Thank you, Justin. That was really tremendous.